From PoliticsPA, my name is Steve Ulrich, and this is Voices of Reason, brought to you by L2 Data. Thank you for joining us. Voices of Reason is a podcast produced by PoliticsPA. For nearly 25 years, the most comprehensive resource on Keystone State politics, and Broad+Liberty, dedicated to the freedom of thought and giving voice to issues and ideas that have been shut out of our discourse for too long. Our goal is to bring you voices of reason from both sides of the Pennsylvania political spectrum. We want you to hear the arguments from those left of center, as well as those right of center. Our goal is not to get everyone to agree. They won't, and that would be boring anyway. Our goal is to provide a dynamic platform for the disagreements amongst us to be aired with substance, reason, and respect, attributes too often missing from today's political discourse. And with the Commonwealth figuring prominently in the 2024 election, this is an opportunity to hear from those who are shaping policy and making news in the Keystone State. You will hear from our Commonwealth's movers and shakers, providing you with all you need to make up your own mind about the future of our state and our nation. So with that, let's begin. I'm pleased to welcome Larry Seisler, the principal of Seisler Media Issue and Advocacy and one of the owners of PoliticsPA. Seisler, along with Jeff Jubelier and David Urban, have made PoliticsPA one of the most important political news brands in the state since 2007. Larry, let's talk about the partnership with PoliticsPA and Broad+Liberty and how important this podcast will be to the partnership going forward.
Thanks, Steve. Good to see you. Good to see you as always. We want to make PoliticsPA over the years has been a very important part of the daily political reading list for a group of people in Pennsylvania who can make things happen. But we decided, this was Dave Urban and Jeff Jubelier and I, that we have our day jobs and we couldn't keep doing this ourselves. And we had to have some help in doing this. And then comes Broad+Liberty. And even though they're on a certain political spectrum and we're like smack dab in the middle, we thought we could make it work. But the podcast is an extension of what we're trying to do. And podcasts are reaching more and more people. But what you don't have in Pennsylvania for the most part is a podcast where people are actually talking to each other and discussing ideas and beliefs. And one of the things I'm really hoping for in this partnership is that each side, right and left, or in the center, they have more exposure to each other. And I think that this podcast is one vehicle in which way to do it.
Larry, anything in particular that you want to venture into for it?
Well, I think it's just how this started and what we're hoping to happen. But you may have felt that I did this. I mean, the fact is, we've never, as you know, Steve, we've never done this for profit. Okay, and it's just we do it because it's a good source for things. But I can come back in other weeks and do it.
So, Larry, what was it that brought PoliticsPA to Broad+Liberty and thought that would be the best partner?
Okay, it's really easy. When Dave Urban, Jeff Jubelier, and I bought PoliticsPA many years ago, it was the idea of Democrats and Republicans working together just to provide very objective political news. It's all it was. Nobody did it to become rich. We did it because it was a service and people appreciated it. So many years later, Dave Urban has this successful lobbying career and he's on CNN. And Jeff Jubelier has a very good communications career, and I'm struggling a little, but I'm doing okay. But the thing that the three of us have in common is we don't know how to take PoliticsPA to the next level. We don't have the resources to do it, and we don't have the professional experience. So I've known Terry Tracy for years over at Broad+Liberty, and he's trying to do something very unique with his site. But the most important thing is he has resources and they have ability. And so we talked to a lot of potential partners, believe me. But when I talked to Terry about Broad+Liberty, I knew what he could bring. But what was also important was I knew why they wanted to have a partnership with PoliticsPA. It was not to change the nature of PoliticsPA, which I know a lot of my Democratic friends were concerned about, but it was actually to be its own brand and to be a stronger brand. And what we're starting to see is something that's really nice. We're seeing people read things from Broad+Liberty that are on politics, that are now on PoliticsPA, that they wouldn't have had exposure to, may not necessarily agree with, but they haven't had exposure to. But then also the reverse. We're seeing pieces that Steve has written on PoliticsPA being on Broad+Liberty, and people are viewing that. So, the one thing that is damaging to our society is these siloed news sources, is this echo chamber. And what I'm hoping by this partnership, and maybe we're going to add others to it, is that we sort of knock down the walls of the echo chamber. So that's basically why we did it.
One other question for you. We're talking about the governor's budget. Your thoughts on Shapiro's budget and the negotiations that are taking place with the appropriations committees at this point?
Yeah. The one thing that impressed me, well, there were two things that impressed me about the governor's budget, was obviously the emphasis that was placed on education and public transportation. Two very important functions of government that touch all Pennsylvanians. I don't care whether you live in the city of Philadelphia or you live back home where I'm from originally in Washington County. So I think the twinnings of these lines and the emphasis that's being placed on them were very important on behalf of the governor. And, I'm really hoping that the legislature sees it his way.
Our thanks to Larry Seisler, principal of Seisler Media and one of the owners of PoliticsPA, for joining us today on Voices of Reason. Now joined by Representative Jordan Harris, the chair of the House Appropriations Committee. Thank you for being here today. Obviously, the first priority in the budget negotiation is education. How do you get everyone to the table, one? And number two, how do you get everyone to the table and stop being adversarial?
Well, I think first of all, thank you for having me. I think, we have to set the table. And by doing that, you have to recognize that we have a Commonwealth Court ruling that says how we fund public education in Pennsylvania is unconstitutional. So that is the first thing that we have to deal with, is that we have to get into constitutionality. And I've said that like several times. I don't even know if that's a real word, but if it's not, it's a real word now. But we have to get into constitutionality with regards to how we fund public education. And for everybody, Democrat, Republican, or urban, rural, or suburban, that should be our number one priority. So you get people to the table, I believe, by understanding that if we don't do this, the court can impose its own formula or its own way of us fixing this financial problem. So I think with that hanging over folks' head, most folks want to come to the table and work it out ourselves before the ability to do so is removed by the court.
Is there a deadline for when this has to be completed before the court could step in?
No, I mean, I don't believe there's a deadline. The petitioners could go back to court for remedy if we don't address this, and I personally believe that most folks don't want to see that. They want the legislature to be able to do our job, which we were elected to do in the first place. So,
you've said that the Child and Dependent Care Enhancement Tax Credit for working families is what a people first agenda looks like. Can you explain how this helps Pennsylvanians?
Sure. I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, anybody that has children can tell you that child care costs have continued to go up. And, there are people out there who are paying a mortgage size bill when it comes to child care. So the Dependent Child Tax Credit enhancement that we did provides folks, whether it's daycare, before or after care, or even summer camp, day camp for young people. If you have up to 2 children under the age of 13, it provides the same level of credit that it does on the federal level. So you get your federal credit and you get your state credit. So some Pennsylvanians will get up to $2,100 back into their pocket. And that's real money going back into folks' pockets that provides them an opportunity to pay the bills, or pay for food, or whatever the issue is for them. This tax credit gives them those resources to do that. So that's when you think about the average Pennsylvanian, and what I call kitchen table politics, and that's basically what are folks talking about at their kitchen tables, right? The financial strains of Pennsylvanians is what folks are talking about. So this puts money right back in their pockets, and that's why I believe it's really looking at people first.
One of the headlines you see when you look at the media today is about the possibility of legalizing marijuana in the Commonwealth. How realistic is that possibility, or is it just really a bargaining chip being tossed around?
Well, I think Pennsylvania is far behind many of our surrounding states that have already done it. I mean, you have people in Pennsylvania literally going right over to Benjamin Franklin or the Walt Whitman Bridge to New Jersey to go get legalized adult use cannabis, and we're missing out on tremendous amount of tax revenue by not legalizing it. That's the first part. The second part is, in many places in this Commonwealth, we're still arresting people for something that we sell medicinally. And that also is a cost to the taxpayer. So I believe that there's a real opportunity to do that. Two things. There's a real opportunity to legalize adult use cannabis. And even if we can't get there, there's a real opportunity to at least decriminalize it in the Commonwealth. I also believe that soon we'll see the federal government doing some things around rescheduling of cannabis. So, Pennsylvania, if we want to, get in front of things, it's high time that we legalize adult use cannabis, tax it, and create the industry here. How
much revenue is possible, do you believe, from this?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of numbers, and those numbers have fluctuated. So I don't want to put a number on it per se, but what I will say is it's a significant amount of money. Think about it this way. Think about all of the places in rural Pennsylvania where we just have tons of farmland. All of that could fuel a large cannabis industry here in Pennsylvania. That one could provide cannabis here for folks in our Commonwealth, but two, once it's rescheduled at the federal level, like the exporting could be tremendous because of all of the space we have. I mean, it's a true opportunity, and it's one that I don't think we want to miss.
Republicans contend that the governor's budget will spend down the Commonwealth's rainy day fund. What's your response to that? And in your mind, what's the appropriate amount that the General Assembly should keep in the rainy day fund?
Well, one of the things that I said during our budget hearing with the budget secretary, I mean, the point of the rainy day fund is for emergencies and to stabilize Pennsylvania's budget. We have an emergency right now, and that emergency is the Commonwealth Court ruling that says that how we fund education is unconstitutional. That is an emergency. It is something that we must deal with. That's number one. Number two, and not to be a provocateur, but for many schools in Pennsylvania, it's actually raining in the school. I mean, we legitimately have schools that are so old, infrastructure that is decaying, where you have places where it's actually raining. So, to say that Pennsylvania doesn't need to invest these resources, and I think that's another thing we have to stop doing. We have to stop thinking about some things as spend and think about it as investing. Because what we're trying to do, and the things that we've outlined that we're trying to do, is really about how do you get a return on these resources. My fear is that we'll sit on these resources and then eventually squander them in a way where we don't get any return on investment. What I can tell you is that the workforce in Pennsylvania is dwindling. We are one of the oldest states in the nation with regards to our population. And when you talk about workforce development, when you talk about luring businesses to want to be here in the Commonwealth, well, businesses aren't going to come to the Commonwealth unless you have a workforce to do what's necessary. And one of the ways you do that is by investing in young people in their schools, by investing in our higher education, our community colleges, our state system universities, our state-related universities, because we know that credentialed people go out and they do things in the workforce. So when you talk about the expansion of Pennsylvania's tax base, when you talk about growing a robust economy, spending those resources in an investment manner is what's necessary.
Is there a target number for what should be kept in a rainy day fund? Because, like you said, it should be invested, not necessarily spent. But is there an appropriate number?
Well, listen. Even after after this budget, if we were to enact everything in this budget, you would still have $11 billion, kind of like in our bank account, right? And I still think it's a transfer of 1 point something billion into the rainy day fund. So, the sky isn't falling financially for Pennsylvania today. But as far as a number, I think, look, I do think we should keep resources in the account. In case there's a catastrophe or something. I don't disagree with that. I don't have a number for it, but what I do know is that we have pressing issues that we can't wait for tomorrow, that we must do today.
Our thanks to Representative Jordan Harris, the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, for joining us on Voices of Reason.
Thanks for having me.
Now we're pleased to be joined by the Republican House Appropriations Chair, Representative Seth Grove. Representative Grove, thanks for joining us. You've said that the governor's spending plan is, and I quote, disingenuous and misleading at best. Why do you believe that's the case?
Yes. So, he came out go back last year, right? He came out with a pretty moderate budget, particularly compared to Governor Wolf, who had these big budget items, big budget asks and stuff like that. Still kind of hard to get done because of obviously the school choice issue. There's still divide on that, and it's still going to be problematic. That issue is still there. And then he came out with this massive budget, massive spend, massive increases in numerous lines between DHS, education, and higher ed blueprint, all kinds of stuff. So, $3.7 billion over actual revenues. It seemed to me more or less as more of a political budget, particularly as he's angling for re-election and potential presidential run. He does not hide the fact he wants to be president of the United States someday. Good for him. At least he's honest about it, right? But it spends more than what we have in recurring revenue. And that's my big issue in budgeting in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Just be honest and realistic. We have X amount to spend. If you want to spend more on recurring expenditures, come up with the recurring revenue to do it. He's basing his entire budget on using one-time dollars in our surplus and eventually dapping into the rainy day fund to bring balance to it in the out years. To me, that's dishonest and just generous, particularly since there's big spending in the out years they don't book. So go back to the Basic Education Funding Commission report that the governor office signed off on, as well as the House Democrats and Senate Democrats. That calls on over $1 billion to be increased education funding for the next 7 years. When you look at his budget documents, that $1 billion is in this year, but is not in the out years, right? The blueprint, higher education, he wants to merge two systems together, but he wants to do a big investment to bring tuition down to $1,000, a semester for PASHE and community colleges. That's a substantial cost that's not in his blueprint or in those out year expenditures. But PAC-FIA has additional dollars next year built into it for $1,000 to try to help the independent schools and the state-related schools by reducing their tuition, by providing more of an incentive for students as well. I don't know how you say, we're gonna put that in the out year, but nothing else. It was big cherry picking on their part to like fudge the numbers and make them look like they actually get to a point of balance in the out years. And it's a problem. Like the 5 year, it's an estimate, but it's also a planning tool. And if you're planning to spend money, you should build it into those tools so you know what's coming down the pike to show, well, this is what we need to do financially to make these things sound. And out years don't need to be balanced. So he could show deficit if he wants to. But the realization is if you want to spend the money and you're planning to spend the money, just be honest with the citizens of the Commonwealth and say, this is what we want to do. And this is what it looks like in the out years.
Is this what you mean in some respects by the phrase structural deficit in the budget, or does that mean something else?
Yeah, structural deficit is when you spend more money than what you bring in on repeat. And we've had it. It goes back to Ed Rendell era. So Governor Rendell, we've had like this $2 billion structural deficit since then. The COVID dollars masked that over. And to be honest with the citizens, before COVID hit, there was a big worry about even being able to get a budget done the next year because that structural deficit, the amount of money between recurring revenue and recurring expenses was $2 billion. And everyone's like, how do we fill this? How do we continue these programs? COVID hit, all this federal dollars came in and it was completely masked over and we supplanted state dollars with federal dollars. That's why we have, between $12 and $14 billion in the rainy day fund, the surplus. Now that number fluctuates because we don't know where we're going to be at the end of the day. So the governor will use the $14 billion number. We're still using $12 billion, 6 and 6, because that's the projection at the end of this fiscal year coming into it. So you can use 14, you can use 12, you can use a combination. We just don't know where it's going to be at the end of this fiscal year with revenues coming in and stuff like that. But that's the big gap. Now, the ironic part is right now we're down to about $800 million, which is really good. So you go from 2 billion, we're down to 800. That's why this year is so critical. If we would pass his plan, that 800 is going to balloon to 3 billion, right? Because you're using one-time revenues. So next year, you automatically need to do $3 billion to get back to where you're at now. Plus any additional spending is going to be another X amount on top of that. That's why we're very worried about how he has his budget structured. Because it's not like if you do $3.7 billion this year, it's not like you're going to come back next year and say, you know what, we're going to do $100 million increase, right? A big increase is going to relate to another big increase next year. So that's why we're always worried about the current year budget and the impact on into the future, right? So if you do something financially sound this year, it puts you in a better spot next year. And this is the lowest we've been on a structural deficit in probably 2 decades. So we have a shot of closing it. And once you close it, you get revenues mixed with recurring revenues mixed with recurring expenditures. It makes it a lot easier to say, okay, we have a $200 million increase next year. Let's deal with that. And the government can always put on revenue on the table for other stuff. But you want to match one-time revenue with one-time expenditures, recurring revenue with recurring expenditures. That's just good budgeting practice. And that's what citizens do at the table, right? It's not like they're going to, if you're spending your savings on your mortgage every single month, and that's the only way you can afford your mortgage, when that money runs out, you're going bankrupt, right? You can't afford your home's being sold, being foreclosed on, the whole 9 yards. We don't want that to occur here in the Commonwealth.
Everyone's pretty much in agreement that the number one budget topic is education, given the Commonwealth Court decision. How do you get everyone to stop being adversarial?
Yeah, it started off with the Basic Education Funding Commission. The court came down and we're like, how we're going to fix this? And it's dumb timing. Like everything about that commission is just stupid timing. It just happened to be the 5-year renewal of that commission. Everyone's like, we're going to use the commission, right? Let's have the discussion there. All parties are in there. we can have that commission reconstitute itself, and it basically it stemmed from inequities in the previous funding formula. We did this commission. It worked out great. Bipartisan, the administration, Democrats, Republicans all agreed on a new funding formula 5 years ago. We adopted it. It's been going great. So they're like, let's do that again. This time was very different. There ended up being two reports, a Democrat majority report and Republican minority report. And the problem with court cases is, we had this last one on the constitutional reality of how we educate education dollars is just being interpreted, right? Like, judges need to learn, just tell us what you want. The longer the opinion is, the more we're going to interpret what you actually want us to do. So just say it. Like, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. Now, I appreciate the judge saying, y'all need to go fix this out, right? Like, General Assembly, governor, not our purview in the judicial branch. You go fix it. Like, I wish every court ruling was like that. Life would be so much better. But at the same time, it was a couple hundred pages, right? So it's going into all this stuff, and her final points, you can interpret them how you want, right? So you could say, oh, that means we're going to do billions of dollars in new spending. It really doesn't say add more money in the system to do that, make it fair, more equitable. We may have to do money to do that, but it doesn't say $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion or $7 billion. None of it says that. It talks about equality and making sure every kid gets the same education. I could argue that means school choice. Democrats could argue, well, we need to invest the money in to make sure every kid has the exact same education every single school. Which one's right? Like, just tell us exactly what you want. Don't fluff it. Don't do kind of political. I mean, the judges kind of do political talk now and then by not just specifying and doing it. I mean, you had to deal with an elections director, right? Like, just tell me what you want us to do, right?
Right.
Don't leave the open for interpretation. So, like, your county is doing one thing, Montgomery is doing another. Just tell us, right? We'll go do it. We'll figure it out. But just tell us what to do. I think that's where we're at with that court case. We have multiple opinions about what the judge really wanted. And it's not like we can bring her in and testify to say, what did you mean, right? Just give us the clarification. So that's a little frustrating. That's kind of where we're at. We have two differing opinions about what that BFC report actually says, what the judge meant in that. And I do, no matter what, anticipate that to be appealed to the Supreme Court. And then I don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do. Are they going to pull the trigger and tell the General Assembly, you are going to put X dollars in, and you know what, we're gonna tell you how to fund it too, because that's the other thing. Like, it's not like we got $1 billion of recurring funds sitting there, and that's the other side of it too. Even the credit rating agencies have said, we expect you, whatever you do with this court ruling, because they know it's coming down the pike, make sure you have recurring revenue to fund it. Don't do one-time stuff, this big spending, and create a out-year financial gap on how you do this. So there's a lot of worry about that structural imbalance and how the Commonwealth, or how we actually manage that court case with education funding into the future.
Do you see this being sent to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court sooner than June 30th, or do you have to go through the entire cycle perhaps to not come up with a solution and then see what happens?
Yeah, I wish I had that magic ball, because I would have won that lottery ticket, yesterday, $700 some $1 million. But I, to be honest, I do not anticipate an on-time budget this year. Everything that drove us to a late budget last year is still there. There's zero resolution outside of people just saying, we're just going to get a bare minimum done. And I don't think the Senate's going to put themselves in a position where they send a budget over that ends up on the governor's desk and stuff like that without an agreement. So I think we are going to be in the long haul. Joe Pittman and Jordan Harris both have elated to, If it goes past the deadline, it goes past the deadline. Jordan said twice, while I appreciate the June 30th deadline, we think we have important things we want to get done in this budget, and it's going to go past. It's going to go past. Pittman basically said the same thing. It's just a number, and we want to get it right. Now, Uri Munson, the budget secretary during budget hearings, said, "Yeah, he doesn't like he prefers getting an early budget done. He doesn't see why it needs to go to June 30th to begin with. But again, you're going to have to get three parties that, want one side wants big education spending, zero school choice. The other side doesn't want big education spending and one school choice. Got to find the middle ground of that. And that's been the big issue since the House Democrats took control of the House. There's just no resolution around school choice.
One of the other issues that's becoming a hot button issue, I guess, around the Commonwealth is the idea of legalizing adult use cannabis. How realistic is legalizing marijuana in the Commonwealth during this budget cycle?
Yeah. So number one, we went through 3 weeks of budget hearings without any legislation on what it looks like. So Department of Ag is supposedly going to be the regulatory entity. There's no language. The secretary basically said, we can definitely handle it. I'm like, well, how do you know? Have you seen the actual legislation? He's like, well, no, but we can do it. I'm like, I don't, and it's frustrating because there's big pieces of this budget we couldn't ask. Recreational marijuana was one of them, right? There's no legislation out there. It is a major funding source of the governor's budget this year and into the future. He had it in his budget last year, if you remember. It was just not for this year, but we're going to discuss it. It's for next year's budget.
Right.
It's a year later, and there's still no legislation. Was it deliberate? So we didn't have something to talk about in budget, right? Was it deliberate to circumvent the entire budget hearing process so we couldn't drill down into the details of it? Maybe. It's a good tactic for the administration. Again, devious, right? I would consider that pretty devious. Skill games, another revenue source, right? 42%. To me, that's probably got the best chance of getting done. There seems to be some coalition around the need to do something with them. And then plus all the gaming entities want changes as well. So the casinos, even the gaming board, VGTs, they all want changes as well. So I think that's got a good chance. I just don't see the Senate Republicans coming in and saying, okay, here's your recreational marijuana, because it's a trade. They're going to ask for something big, and I don't think the House Democrats are going to be there to carry that.
One of the things that we hear from Democrats is talking about how if you funded everything in the governor's budget, you'd still have $11 billion in the rainy day fund. According to Pew Research, Pennsylvania could run on its rainy day fund for approximately 44 days, longer than most of the contiguous states. What do you think the appropriate amount should be in Pennsylvania's rainy day fund?
So we've looked at this. We're going to have an academic discussion right now because there's no right amount, right? So states after the Great Recession, I think you need to look at the volatility of your revenue sources. Every revenue source is ebb and flow. So a broad tax across a lot of spectrum has low volatility. So if you have a tax structure that has low volatility, that really doesn't move tremendously with high economic output and low economic downturn, right? You don't need as much back in your rainy day fund to cover a loss during an economic depression or a recession. So you have to have a volatility report. Now, our revenues aren't that volatile compared to a lot of other states. So if you look at Wyoming, their main source of revenue is the gas industry, right? So gas industry is having a good year. Wyoming's got a lot of money. Gas industry has a bad year. They're in trouble, right? Revenue wise. So they have to have a lot back to sustain those highs and lows. Now, our sales tax doesn't have a broad base, so that's a volatile tax. Our income tax is pretty good, a lot more stable, right? So you take the percentage of, and it's a calculation like urban league. Everybody like it is a known factor to calculate the volatility of states' revenue structures. So you just take that number and then you apply it to your budget, and then you get a percentage and what you have back. Looking back at the Great Recession, we're almost there. Like if we continue those inputs for the next few years, we'll be at a point where we can sustain that. And the big thing is not only how much you have, but how you draw it out and how you put it in. So during the Great Recession, Governor Rendell basically put all the money in 1 year. So the next year, like our state really, it takes about 4 years for us to rebound from the Great Recession. It took 4 years to get us back to where we were with revenues. So you need to create a drawdown that lasts 4 years. So a large percentage year one, and then you shrink it out so you flatten that out a little bit, and then you have money. Because really, if you do it all in 1 year, the next budget revenues will not bounce back, and you still have that gap. So it doesn't create a good structure moving out. So we need to work on the withdrawal of those monies. Now, Pew has great research on how states input revenue and also do that. And Pew also brings up the importance of not using one-time revenue sources or recurring revenues. I mean, it's like they have really good, I think, academic research and really good ideas on how to do that. And they show states, blue states, red states that have good kind of fiscal policies around those things. So that's the big thing. You need to look at it from a volatility perspective. Tim O'Neill, our minority whip, he introduced a constitutional amendment. I think was it last session? It was last session on the rainy day fund, both setting a maximum amount based on volatility of our revenue sources, and then also set up a constitutional policy on drawdown of that. Because the rainy day fund in statute did have a 2/3 vote to remove it. During Ed Rendell's administration, line 1 was elimination of the 2/3 vote, and line 2 was a complete withdrawal of the rainy day fund. So if it's in statute, you can just repeal it and do whatever you want. Constitutional amendment, it takes too much time to do that. That's why it basically secures whatever you want to do. And it's a good policy to make sure you're using the rainy day fund for its actual use, and making sure you have a good policy on money going into it, how much you should have in that, because there is a point where it's going to be too much money, and that's where that volatility comes. It connects it back to how much revenues are basically how much we're spending, right? How volatile our revenues are. So it sets it up based on our actual needs, not a magic number. Generally, there was like this number that was thrown out. I was actually at a conference at the Fed in Chicago a few years ago, but it was put on by the Volcker Alliance. And the head of NASBO at the time, he's like, I apologize for setting how much states need to be in. He's like, someone asked me at a conference, I said like 15%, and everybody coalesced, oh, the magic number is 15%. He's like, it was just a random number I threw out. I said, in some states need 15, probably some need maybe 50, depending on, and then that's where this whole volatility thing came about, of kind of looking at what states actually need by state comparison. So that's really the direction we need to go in. That way it's based on our actual needs. It's based on our tax structure. Listen, we make tax structure changes all the time, right? So as we make those tax structures, you need to make sure you have that analysis of volatility of your tax structure moving forward.
Our thanks to Representative Seth Grove, the House Appropriations Chair for the Republican Caucus. Thanks very much for joining us on Voices of Reason.
No problem. Hopefully it wasn't too boring talking about finances, but it's the important thing.
It was the academic side of the podcast. Thank you.
Right. It went downhill. One downhill once you started talking about academics. Downhill.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you participating. And I look forward to meeting you in person at some point since, as you know, I've done work in York County. We just never crossed paths. So
yeah, it's all good. Appreciate
Okay.
it. Yeah. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Welcome to Voices of Reason's Roundtable segment. My name is Terry Tracy, CEO of PoliticsPA and Broad+Liberty. And with us today, we have Paul Westcott, Executive Vice President of L2 Data, Inc., Farah Jimenez, CEO of the Philadelphia Education Fund, Representative Gina from Delaware County, representing the 164th Legislative District and member of the Education Committee, and a man who probably needs no introduction. But I'll do it anyway. Senator Vincent Hughes, who is the Senate Appropriations Chair for the Democratic Caucus. Senator, let's start with you. I'm going to give you the floor here on the governor's budget. Education has to come first after the Commonwealth Court decision on fairly funding schools. But can Governor Shapiro rebuild the trust with skeptical Senate Republicans after supposedly reneging on the deal last year over the Lifeline Scholarship bill? How do we get everybody around the table to work together?
Got it. So let me just, for purposes of clarity, you're the boss of PoliticsPA? Right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you're the one that sends me all those emails every morning. About what I need to read.
That's actually Steve's fault, wherever he went. But
Okay, I just want to be clear. For anybody who's watching, blame it on him or subscribe, because thank you for the information. It's pretty good, and it's comprehensive, and it's pretty accurate as well. So look, what we need to understand with the state budget, and having done a few in my career, we have an unprecedented opportunity to address a number of major issues and still keep the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania fiscally sound for years to come. We're sitting on a budget surplus of $14 billion. We have never had those kinds of resources. We have never come close to having those kinds of resources in the history of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Never. And so the opportunity now is to address some major issues and make some major investments. Pennsylvania ranks 48th in the nation with respect to the amount of money that it provides local school districts in terms of funding public education. It ranks 49th in the nation with the amount of money that it provides young people or people of any age to go to college. And so consequently, we're stagnant as a Commonwealth on some of the two most important investments that need to be made. And so we have the opportunity to resolve it. And the interesting thing that the governor said in his budget address, that when he finished, if we did everything that he asked us to do, we would still have $11 billion of surplus and still have enough resources to move the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania forward and still be stable and continue to make investments in job creation, in economic development, in cleaning and greening our environment, in all the things that matter to the people of Pennsylvania, to reduce the pressure of prescription drugs, okay, to provide relief for local taxpayers, to get assistance to people who really need it. We are positioned to do this. Lowest unemployment rate in the history of the Commonwealth, largest budget surplus in some of the most difficult communities, the African American community. Pennsylvania's unemployment rate for the African American community is lowest in the history of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Strong economy. Let's now double down, all right, and make these investments, but make smart investments, and so that this can continue going forward.
Senator, I think one of the challenges that Democrats have in making this argument about an improving economy is that, yes, while inflation continues to improve, although it ticked up, I saw again, the CPI went up by 3.2% today, but that's sort of a blip on the radar screen relative to the larger trend. But as inflation numbers continue to come down, real prices don't. As unemployment continues to come down, many of those jobs that are being added are low-wage jobs that, relative to high real prices, makes it very challenging for folks to feel like things are getting better. How does this budget improve the real circumstances of folks' lives?
It makes investments in child tax care. Child tax credits, okay? It makes investments in early childhood education. And some of these forces that are driving and making feel like something is not right. I think the president referred to it, and Senator Casey has referred to it, with the, sort of like in the Girl Scout cookie, they used to be larger, okay? You used to get more Girl Scout cookies, all right? Or there used to be more Snickers in the Snicker bar, okay?
The Girl Scouts are the ones robbing us?
No, I don't believe that.
Terrorists.
I believe the manufacturers, or the chip bag, okay? They used to have more chips in the chip bag. Right. Chip bags getting more expensive, but there's less chips in the chip bag, okay? So those real around the table issues that you think about, they are real. But the facts indicate that things are going in the right direction, and we cannot escape the dollars and cents picture of the Commonwealth's budget. Even if you say, all right, the governor's wrong, and the governor's budget secretary is wrong, and the governor's revenue secretary is wrong, and you go to the independent fiscal office for their analysis, they say, well, it's not going to be an $11 billion surplus after the governor's, if we do everything the governor budget. It's going to be a $10 billion surplus, okay? So there's a difference of $1 billion, but still a huge amount of money going forward. We've got to make these investments. They're crucial for the current situation for people in Pennsylvania and for going forward.
Farah, let's kick it over to you. So the IFO, the Independent Fiscal Office, testified before the Appropriations Committee this week that there's risk in the governor's budget, upwards of $8 billion. Can you speak to that broadly, and then if you want to pick up on this education issue as well?
Well, I'm going to start by responding to the question you initially posed, which is, can the governor, given the blips from the last go-around, really bring Republicans and Democrats together to pass a really, I don't know if I would call it aggressive, but hopeful and a desired impactful budget? And the way I respond to that is to remind people that the last two rounds where he ran statewide, he was the highest vote getter across the Commonwealth when he ran for Attorney General both times, and then also when running for governor. And that's significant because what it indicates is that in our Commonwealth, which generally, if you look at the map, is very, very red except for the two coasts, it means that people in a bipartisan way, are really supportive of this particular governor. And I think it's because, now moving on to policy, he chooses policy agenda items that I think really at their core mean a lot to both Republicans and Democrats, education being the central theme, but he's approached it in a way where it's really difficult to make an argument that that is not a wise investment. So his blueprint for higher education in particular is responding to a need that the Commonwealth has. Most people think we have a statewide system of education like the University of North Carolina system or the University of California system. That is not the case in the Commonwealth. In Pennsylvania, we have a state-affiliated higher education system or state-related higher education institutions, which means each independent institution makes its best market decisions and views the other's competition, not part of a collaborative where they have to decide what's the best way to deploy resources to make sure we're serving constituents. So what the governor has proposed, if you're in Butler County or you're in Somerset County, which are Republican strongholds, you could see the value in that because you're trying to bring educational resources that will help your constituents be able to access the level of education that they need to access the jobs in their community. One clear example of that, which I thought was really compelling and having heard some of the policy directors, is that you can have counties where the jobs that are family sustaining, that help address inflation challenges for families, are in counties where you only need a 2-year degree to obtain that job, but there are not 2-year degree institutions there. So if you're to get the degree that you need, you either have to go someplace else or you have to get a 4-year degree, which means you're paying a lot more for the level of education you need to obtain the jobs that you need. I think for the governor, the challenge, and I think for the legislature as well, the challenge will be how to build that narrative in a way that Republicans in particular will embrace it, because it needs to be viewed as an investment in the long term, a very costly investment for sure in the near term, but in the long term, one that will pay dividends. Ultimately, whether or not you believe it's wise to spend any of the dollars that are currently available, it's really a question if you view it as an expenditure, which those who would be opposed would view it as an expenditure, and those who would be supportive would view it as an investment. I will also say that the blip last year probably didn't even really factor on the Richter scale, because the governor has been able to rebuild those relationships that he needs to move an agenda forward. I think the only place where there might be a wrinkle will be the continuing support for lifeline scholarships. I can't remember what they've called them now, because that is really important to Republicans who want to continue to introduce more school choice mechanism. And it is offending to traditional supporters of traditional public school system that view that it is an undermining of the traditional public school system. And so that's where the tension will be. But when you look at that amount of money, which I think at least the last go around was $100 million, it is basically a rounding error in the size of our budget.
0.2%.
So hopefully that gets off the table. The Lifeline Scholarship moves forward. The Republicans are happy, and then they can support the broader agenda.
I think one of the things that keeps Republicans up at night when they look at this proposed investment into the existing public school system is really two things. One, over the last couple of years, there's been sort of an experiment with a massive injection of, in this case, federal funds through the ARPA legislation into the public school system, and not feeling like there's been a whole lot of return, right? And so is more money really the answer? I know Broad and Liberty did an analysis recently of 14 school districts across southeastern Pennsylvania, where it was actually sort of the middle tier of schools that were performing the best in terms of academic output. So the very wealthy districts got even more money, and their outcomes were not quite as good as some of the middle tier districts. Some of the poorer districts got substantially more money based on the way the money was over-indexed, and results continued to decline. So to the extent this is an outcomes-based discussion, or the investments are tied to, I think Senator Scott Martin called it accountability, but I think what everyone is really looking for is improved outcomes. How do you frame the discussion around that dynamic in a way that makes it more productive, and not just the same old discussion about we need to spend however many billion more dollars, or we need to keep every penny in the piggy bank?
I think the challenge is when you have a significant infusion of cash, as was true with ARPA funding that came to the schools, is that the infrastructure doesn't exist to absorb that and to activate it in a way that really delivers results. And so those dollars came in, you have 2 years to spend it. I mean, these are big bureaucracies. And so how do you organize yourself to quickly be able to get a return on that investment that's meaningful? Also, 2 years of spending to offset all the losses academically that happened with students during the COVID years, it's not long enough. So that's why it's important to assess a problem from, is it an investment? Is it going to deliver a long-term result? Are you making the investment over a long enough period of time to really get that result? I think too often we're looking like shovel-ready, quick fixes, let's just get some after-school programs and kids will feel good and that will make everything better. That's not like the right approach. It's really whether or not you're going to be able to sustain, build the kind of infrastructure that can be sustained that helps move things forward for students. And too often we're looking for quick fixes.
Representative Kerry, prior to being elected to the legislature, you served on a school board for many years, and in a district that faces a number of the kinds of challenges that we're talking about needing to address here. Care to, we'll give you the floor here. It's all yours.
Sure. Thank you, Terry. I think that what Farah said is key. We have to look at the investment not only for the children who are in these schools. It wasn't enough time, but I also look at the taxpayers that everyone that's in that school district, right? We have been laying a heavy burden on taxpayers for years without outcomes, right? With the outcomes that we're not really happy about in these school districts. And when you have school districts that have been under invested in for years, decades. I mean, we talked about this, Terry, decades. Then you're not going to be able to infuse that type of money and get an outcome 2 years later. As a parent in my school district and the school district that I represent, I feel very much excited about what the governor is trying to do. I think we have decades to move forward where we've been behind for so long. One of the school districts that I represent is William Penn School District, which was a main namer in the lawsuit. And I'm proud to be representing that school district. But just like Chairman Harris said earlier, there is actually rain coming down in the middle school where they've had to cover the floor. They can't have their 8th grade ceremony, moving forward ceremony this year. These are the things that our kids have learned to navigate, have learned to be accepting of, and it's unfair. And so when I listened to the governor's budget and talked about $1.1 billion, it is our time. It's our time to get that money in and really pay attention. I've had both superintendents calling me and saying, how can we even, when it's time for the budget, right, Senator? It's like June 30th, right? But we need to make plans right now to be able to get trauma-informed care in our schools, to be able to get, look at transportation. We need these funds now. If we can't get this budget passed by June 30th, our school districts continue to suffer. They can't do the things that they need to do in planning, and it really puts a heavy burden not only on the great school boards that we have out here in the Commonwealth, but on the taxpayers, the seniors, the folks that don't even have children in the schools anymore. They continue to take the burden of this disinvestment.
Thank you, Representative Kerry. We'll have to leave it there for now. That's all the time we have for today's roundtable discussion. Joining me again is Managing Editor of PoliticsPA, Steve Ulrich, and Paul Westcott, who we introduced just a few moments ago. Paul, Executive Vice President of L2 Data, Inc., and our corporate partner in this project. Paul, welcome and thank you. Gentlemen, let's talk about the politics of all this now. Steve, as you've covered closely over the course of the last year, with 4 or 5 resignations in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, it has been effectively tied for most of the last year, making it very hard to advance legislation. In fact, it was so close even at the conclusion of last cycle that House Democrats changed the definition of the word majority in order to make sure that they retained the practical majority should things like this occur, and they've occurred repeatedly. So give us the lay of the land, and hopefully we can get an informed perspective from Paul as well.
No great surprise, for the first time in 12 years, Democrats taking control of the House chamber in Harrisburg, and they don't want to let it go. So when you take a look around the important state House races, all 203 seats are up in November, we asked L2 Data to give us a sense of what were the most important races that you should watch as we move ahead into the primary and the general election, and what the data shows us, Paul.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, so looking at some of the core districts, right? I mean, 160, 137, 187, you can see them laid out across the map here. These districts all have a lot of things in common. They're all very suburban. They're very white. They're older, 55 plus, make up the majority of each of these districts. And they have a split party ID. So in Pennsylvania, you're registering by party, and of course, it's split almost 50-50 within the data. So these are the races to watch as they really represent sort of the swing areas throughout the state.
Do you find that when you look in the national focus, particularly with the presidential race between President Biden and former President Trump, do you think that there's going to be more national forces that will determine how the outcome takes place in the Commonwealth, or will it really bear down into the local races and the local areas?
Working with a lot of political consultants and campaign runners in the state and people who look at these things, they'll tell you, yeah, sure, education, infrastructure, taxes, all going to be very important, the local issues, the important issues that are going to drive people. But really, at the end of the day, things like abortion, immigration, any of the exit polling we've seen in the past few months has indicated that those are core issues for Pennsylvania voters as well. So you've got a mix of factors that are going to come into it. And of course, it's all going to come down to what happens right before early voting and of course, right up to Election Day. But it does appear that you are going to have this national surge. Obviously, there's, Donald Trump and Joe Biden play a big role in this, but you're going to have other national issues that creep into it, as well as things like abortion and IVF.
Paul, how do these swing districts compare to the electorate in the Commonwealth at large?
Yeah, looking at the electorate at large, it's a little bit more diverse, a little bit younger. So you do have a little bit more of a mix, a little bit more rural area, more urban areas split throughout. Obviously you're going to see a very different type of electorate when you get into Pittsburgh and Philadelphia versus, some of the other places like Erie or places throughout the state where, you have some of the industrial type older parts of the state as well. So, or blue collar parts of the state. So it's very, there's a lot of demographic differences when you're talking about the state as a whole in terms of who's actually going to show up. And one of the big things that a lot of demographers and, election watchers are watching right now is really who's actually showing up for some of these early elections, who showed up in some of the special elections last year, because in a low turnout election, things get wobbly. You don't know exactly who's going to show up. And what we've seen in some of these early primaries is people are not as interested in this initially, at least the electorate at large, as many people thought they would be. So if the turnout remains low and that carries through till November, knowing who these individual voters are is going to be very important.
How important is the presidential race to the local state house races that we've pulled out in terms of enthusiasm?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting part, and I'm glad you mentioned that, the interesting part of these local races is a lot of these, and these sort of high profile races, these clearly get a lot of attention from the House and really Senate caucuses as well. But really, the House caucuses put a lot of attention on this because there's high turnout. You bombard people with ads, you bombard people with messaging, you knock doors, text message, all those different things you do in campaigning. People are going to show up, and in these districts, more than half the districts are what we call 75% plus voters. These are people who show up 3/4 of the time or more. So you have super high propensity turnout. They're going to show up. They are going to pay attention to the local issues, but finding the remainder of those people, the people who could really swing it, the 12% on average in these districts that are independents, that's going to be the difference maker here, and seeing how those people are going to be able to swing out as well.
Much has been made about how college-educated, sort of upper middle class professionals have been driving the political realignment that we've seen in the country over the last several years, with the other side of that same coin being working class voters now identifying more with the Republican Party, whereas legacy Republicans that tended to be upper middle class now leaning towards the Democrats. Although when you zero down into sort of whether a Democrat or a Republican represents these districts or how they've performed over the last couple of cycles, talking about the suburbs as a monolith doesn't really get to the heart of what's going on here in this realignment. You might have folks in Montgomery County or Delaware County in southeastern Pennsylvania in the suburbs behaving very differently than you would see in Upper St. Clair, right, in the western part of the state. What can you tell us about what's going on here, and how do the parties make sense of their messaging and their tactics and their turnout machines in an electorate that is as scrambled as it is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, non-monolithic is the key term here, because these voters do need to be looked at on an independent household neighborhood type level versus saying, okay, we're going to hit all the suburbs. We've got a good map here I'll pull up. But essentially what we're looking at when you're looking at the state, the suburbs that's a very broad term when you're using it. So I'm going to recolor the map now from party identification, and now we're looking at based on rural, suburban, urban. We call this the urbanicity map. So you can see those suburban areas outside of Philadelphia, around Allentown, Harrisburg, and out to Pittsburgh and throughout the state are in red. And, for anybody who's watched Pennsylvania politics for any period of time, you know that those suburban areas around Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, all very different, all have very different policy cares and wants and needs. Now, a lot of them are going to be talking about education, but as we've heard today, there are many different ways, to interpret who's getting the right education funding, things like that. And these suburban voters who are said to be able to determine elections, and you can see they make up 38% of the electorate, all have very different passions and things that are going to turn them out.
Turnout has been the key, Steve. I mean, over the last couple of cycles, Democrats have had a turnout machine seemingly at unparalleled levels, whereas Republicans, particularly in the early voting stages, have struggled to get buy-in. And there's this sense out there that former President Trump animates a certain latent part of the electorate. They'll support him, but they may not necessarily feel the same fealty to the Republican Party, and that explains some of their down ballot woes. Although some of this just seems like good old-fashioned blocking and tackling, sort of trench warfare politics too. What's your take?
It's hard to think right now that reproductive rights doesn't become the predominant issue when you look at the race in Pennsylvania right now. Women will turn out to vote on this. And I think the big question that I'm looking at is, will that supersede those MAGA Republicans that want to turn out and cast that third vote for Donald Trump? How's that all play out? I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of data is available. But you're right, we don't see a lot of the hardcore Trump supporters care much else about being able to cast the vote for Donald Trump.
Paul, are you seeing the same?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've actually just re-updated the map here to take a look at this a little bit, where you're seeing this is your pro-life versus pro-choice. And you can see it's a larger pro-choice swath among our modeling here from our partners at Haystack DNA. And they basically take a look and build mirror models across the state and say, if people responded a certain way on abortion, we're going to find people who look like those individuals. And that's how we colored this. And you can see that those areas of pro-choice around, the Philadelphia suburbs, but also around up into Allentown and sort of the northeastern corridor in the Scranton area. So I absolutely agree with you, Steve, that reproductive rights are definitely going to be part of the conversation. And if Democrats break through with that messaging and push it over and over and over again, as they've done successfully in a number of states and special elections, things like that, I think that'll drive out those sort of the suburban women that are out there. Not to say that all suburban women think alike, but at the end of the day, they've tended to focus more on those, those life issues or the choice issues, and can swing elections when they maybe haven't shown up in the past.
If I'm the Pennsylvania GOP or advising their campaigns, and I'm looking at this map, it tells me I better have a better explanation than I've had in the last couple of cycles on this issue. I'll throw one anecdote out there. I was looking at some suburban Philadelphia precinct level details from the 23 election. And what was interesting was that local Republican candidates running for hyperlocal office, mayor, council, school board, those kinds of races, actually performed much, much better than you'd expect. I think the frustration with the other issues around education, the economy, and crime and public safety certainly showed up in those local races. While it may not have translated to wins everywhere, you saw Republicans starting to perform like they used to in the Colorado counties, 52, 55, 58% of the vote. But the top of the ticket for Supreme Court, where Carolyn Carluccio was basically carpet bombed, right, for 2 months over this particular issue, she was in the low to mid 40s.
Right.
And that delta probably explains two things. One, obviously her own demise at the polls, but perhaps those local candidates from starting to be able to become insurgent and start to claw back some of the ground that the GOP has lost in suburbs in the recent years.
Yeah, and it's definitely possible. I mean, the one part of this map that I haven't shown are the unknowns. These are the people who don't fall into the tip of the spear voters on each of these sides. And you can see the map gets a lot more gray and a lot more hazy once you start to introduce those individuals. So that's really important. That's 4 million people right there, 4 million voters. But I absolutely agree that, it's going to be and you can see this in the national media. And I have at home when I'm watching television during the day, I keep on, news channels in blocks of 4, and I'll have Fox, MSNBC, CNN, and I see them all. And it's almost like a mirror of what the campaigns are. And you've got MSNBC focused on Trump court cases and IVF and abortion. And then Fox is focused on immigration and crime. And so you can see that that's sort of the Democratic messaging and the Republican messaging that are just displayed there. And that's what you're going to see. And it's really about who's going to win the ad war, who's going to win the messaging war. And, depending on what happens, I mean, the external factors of the courts, what happens with other legislation, who knows what other state courts, like Alabama's state court ruling, has nothing to do with Pennsylvania. But at the end of the day, there was a lot of Pennsylvanians who were upset about it.
Go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, when you look at the map prior, it wasn't that long ago when Chester County was rock solid red.
Right.
And now all of a sudden that's beginning to change and becoming more purple. Lancaster County and York County in particular, right now, the GOP really continues to need to roll up big numbers to be able to compete in statewide elections. Any data showing that these issues that we're talking about are beginning to affect those counties, as well as Dauphin County, where obviously the state capital.
I'm glad you mentioned Chester, because Chester confounds me. Chester County only has a registration delta of, I think it's 5,000 or 6,000, but it's performing like it's, the Chestnut Hill or something like that, the Ninth Ward of Philadelphia. It's been really fascinating to watch. Or,
yeah.
If you're a Republican, maybe fascinating is the wrong word, but.
Well, I live in Chester County, and it's very interesting that you see the different demographic pieces of it. I live in a part called the Panhandle, which essentially juts into Montgomery and Delco, and those areas, much bluer, much more sort of blue, purpley kind of colors. And then you would think that the area out in the western part of the county and the southeastern part of the county would also be that sort of redder kind of color. But you can see it's almost like the red's being chased out west here in the map, where you have a lot of gray. There's the little Panhandle area I mentioned here, but then you have this sort of grayish, reddish area that just keeps getting a little bit bigger. And we've seen pieces recently about sort of the light bluing of Pennsylvania, kind of is represented here in Chester County.
Despite the fact that the GOP is picking up numbers in registration, it's interesting to see what the hard numbers tell you, right, versus what is actually happening on the ground and what's moving voters, and which goes back to this realignment of the coalitions.
Absolutely. And I'm pulling up some of the numbers on party registration here, because I also think it's important just based on what I'm seeing with the visual. But also looking at this, I mean, you still have 15.4% nonpartisan, which is a larger percentage than the state as a whole. So you've got this large nonpartisan group baked in here. And quite frankly, the delta is not too great. It's only 42. It's just you happen to have more clusters of Democratic voters here, but it is pretty darn close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if there was ever any speculation as to why L2 was the right partner for this project, it would be that Paul watches all 4 cable news channels simultaneously, which is something only a PoliticsPA or Broad and Liberty reader could probably fully appreciate, right?
Exactly.
Yes. God bless your wife.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your
My pleasure.
project.
Absolutely. Thank you.